Welcome to Cincinnati Soccer Talk, the podcast covering all things soccer in the Queen City. So get in touch, soccer fans. Email us at feedback@cincinnati-soccertalk.com. Now, here's your host, Nick Suberly.
Hey, what's happening, CSTers? It's another fine Monday evening here as we cover all things Cincinnati soccer. It's going to be a busy offseason, folks. So we thought this week here on the show, we were going to give you a little MLS 101, a little edumacation, as I like to call it, about how things work in Major League Soccer. You're going to hear terms like GAM and TAM, terms we've said here before on this show, but you're going to learn a little bit more about it this week because we've got a really great guest lined up for you this week. Jeff Rueter, he is one of the MLS writers over at The Athletic over in Minnesota. He covered Minnesota United's foray into Major League Soccer a few years ago. So Jeff knows the ins and outs of how this all works. So we're really excited to have Jeff on, who's, like I said, a good expert on what it means to get into Major League Soccer and how everything is built. So we're going to be joined by him here in just a few moments. Of course, we're going to talk MLS playoffs. Yes, we're going to actually talk about Major League Soccer on this show. It's time we start to transition from that, our ex-girlfriend. We're moving on to the new, prettier lady in Major League Soccer. So we're going to talk about that. And, of course, we want to hear from you as well. You can always get in touch with us on social media. At Cincy Soccer Talk is our Twitter handle. We'll be monitoring all the comments tonight during the live stream, so it should be a really fun one. We're glad to have back on the show. We welcome in Boston Brazil. Boston, how are you, man?
Doing well, Subs. I'm happy to be back on Cincinnati postseason talk. The podcast doesn't get the credit it deserves in the offseason, but I tell you what, I've lived in this city long enough to know the people want more time for postseason rumors and logo changes, Alan Koch plane watches, and Kenny Walker trick-or-treat sightings. So going deep into the playoffs just doesn't give us enough time to adequately prepare for what we need to cover in this offseason. So we're glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you back. Excited to have your take on the speculation, because I know you're knee-deep in all the conspiracy theories and whatnot. So good to have you back. Also really glad to have back on the show Brad Weigel, who, he went all out for us tonight, folks. He absolutely did, because he's on the road, and he made it happen tonight. So, Brad, welcome back to Cincinnati Soccer Talk.
This is my 5th out of 6 weeks in a row. My wife said I've been on the show 2 months, so she kicked me out so you guys can see my new studio. You guys got it all decked out in scarves and all that. I just had to wear my DI shirt just to, be a little bit part of the mood. But, yeah, I'm happy to be here, even though, actually, I might be further away from Cincinnati than you are right now, Subs.
Yeah, where are you?
Goshen, Indiana. I'm like 4 hours away from northern Cincinnati.
Okay.
It'd be pretty close.
Yeah, we're probably... Yeah.
Are you scouting some high-class Goshen talent for Alan Koch while you're there?
I can't disclose.
Oh, okay. we all know Goshen's a huge soccer hotspot.
Soccer, massive hub for soccer.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, glad to have you back. Although I'm a little disappointed, Brad, that your hotel Wi-Fi is a little bit better than your home internet. How does that work out?
I know. You'd think I'd pay enough for it, too.
Well, I'm glad to have you back. Looking forward to getting your thoughts on, the roster build for 2019, as well as, some results around the league. Now, I mentioned that we are a Major League Soccer podcast going forward. I think it is fair that we probably touch on some stuff that happened in the United Soccer League over the weekend. This is the, how do I want to put this? The team down south managed to put 5 on the team that FC Cincinnati failed to score against in the postseason. Just an absolute drubbing. Louisville once again in the conference finals, or in the USL finals, I should say. Does it make it that much more? Ugh. Guys, anything?
It's painful a little bit.
Yeah.
Considering we lost 4 games all season, 4, and one of them happens to be in the postseason, especially after a 10-game winning streak and 23 whatever unbeaten. was a heck of a season. It really was, and it stinks that it boils down to, and it's just the way American sports work, but it boils down to who wins 4 in a row at the end, and only one team can do it. And so far, that looks like Louisville and Phoenix.
Yeah. What about you, Brad?
Yeah, it sucks, but I guess it's good to have your farm team doing well in the playoffs.
Oh, that's fantastic. I want to quickly move on because there is some good news surrounding FC Cincinnati and the USL. It was announced today that Emmanuel Ledesma and Forrest Lasso were named first team All-USL. Corbin Bone was the second team All-USL. And those guys, tremendous honors. So we should give it up for those guys for the tremendous year that they had. Any surprises in that announcement today, Brad?
I feel like I kind of knew Forrest Lasso and Ledesma, they were going to get first team. You could just see Ledesma's the MVP, and arguably Lasso is going to be up for Defender of the Year. They put all the stats out where he was, top of the charts. But I was glad for Corbin Bone because he is an unsung hero. Every year, the last couple of years, somebody's been brought in to replace him, and he just continues and continues and continues to impress. And he's become a linchpin, and so I'm glad to see that he was rewarded for that all of his effort the last couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I was a little surprised, Boston, that Corbin was second team. I thought he had a really good year. I mean, look, this is a tough league. He had double-digit goals. Second team, I guess, is good, but I don't know. I guess I was a little surprised he wasn't up there. I guess you can't have every FC Cincinnati player on the first team.
No, of course you can't. The USL's got to spread the love, and the fact that we got 2 players on there when they're probably trying to put as many teams as they can on the first 2 teams is impressive. And I mean, there was some snubs, not FC Cincinnati really. The Pittsburgh Riverhounds have Greenspan on there, and I was blown away by that. I mean, I thought Nico Brett was by far their star player, and yet they have a defender. I get they had a good defense, but still, like it's I don't know. It's tough because you got Lancaster and Rios and all these different players around the league that are, Aiden Quinn was on there. He had a great year. So I mean, some of it's I would pick it, but
yeah.
I got a little confused with some of the defensive picks.
I mean, you made a good point. You kind of have to diversify, but I think having 3 FC Cincinnati players is fair. I mean, I know we bowed out of the playoffs earlier than we expected to, but this was a regular season award, and we lost 3 matches. We set almost every record you could imagine. So, it's hard not to believe it or, that we deserve these 3 guys getting this award. So congrats to them. And I think, also congrats to Alan and his coaching staff, because that's not just on the players, but, that's the whole organization needs to be congratulated for that, because if you don't put those players in the right position to succeed, they're obviously not going to earn those high honors.
Yeah. And it was well-deserved. Manu being the first guy to do what he did as far as goals and assists in a season. Obviously we think that there should be some further announcements throughout this week about what he could potentially win as far as USL honors go. I mean, Forrest was just a rock back there at center back for FC Cincinnati. It was rare that he did not play at that left center back spot, and he was just a rock back there. As for Corbin, tremendous year, double-digit in goals. I didn't think any of us thought that we would see the year that Corbin Bone had when the year started. I didn't think anybody thought Corbin Bone was going to be a 10-goal scorer for FC Cincinnati. He goes out and does a tremendous job. So kudos to those guys for making it on those all-USL teams. On that note, it's time for the newest segment here on Cincinnati Soccer Talk. We're doing something a little bit different this week. We got a little bit of a setup here because Boston had this tremendous idea, because we all know that Alan Koch likes to go once the season's over, he gets on a jet and he flies out of Cincinnati faster than, I don't know. He's just fast. It's a terrible segue. But so Boston came up with this soundbite. I thought I would do a little bit better of a job and try to improve it. But I'm going to play Boston's audio first, and we'll introduce the segment with Boston since this was his idea.
Where in the world is
Coach Alan Koch?
That's such great audio. Well done, Boston. So where is Alan Koch these days?
That's my knifey line audio right there. No, Alan. We saw multiple check-ins for him. I think so far we've tracked him to 3 places. Right, we have him in Switzerland, Netherlands, and then today he popped up in Denmark of all places. And we know we have one player that's already there, but I'm sure he's doing some other scouting.
Where in the world is
Coach Alan Koch?
It's so great. Brad, go ahead.
I'm waiting for Alan Koch to get down to South America.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you.
Yeah, man. I'm sure he's going to. And, was it Pat Brennan on his Beyond the Net show? He was talking about how Alan got out of here right away and scouting across Europe, and he said Luke Sassano has been gone for a while now, so I'm excited to see what they're out there building. But yeah, I think I'm let the speculation roll.
Yeah, we're gonna have all kinds of rumors floating around about who's staying, who's going, who's coming in from across the pond, no matter which way, whether it be east in Europe or south in South America. But I'm with you. I'd like to see them heading down there. Now, so I kind of introduced this segment talking about our 2 audio sound bites. So Boston, we've heard his twice now. I'm going to play mine. Or we're going to leave it up to the audience to see which one is better. There's no pressure here. There's no pressure, even though I hit the buttons every week on the show. We want to hear from you. So I'm going to play mine now. And you let me know, feedback at CincinnatiSoccerTalk.com, which one is better. So let's play Boston's one more time so everybody could hear the gloriousness that is Boston.
where in the world is
Coach Alan Koch?
Which is great. All right.
It's good, so deep.
Yeah, well, and here's mine.
where in the world is
Alan Koch going now. All right, so we want to hear from you. Feedback at CincinnatiSoccerTalk.com. Whoever gets the most feedback, we're going to keep their soundbite. I'm secretly hoping it's Boston's, but yeah. Anyway, as I mentioned to start the show, we want to talk a little Major League Soccer now before we get hook up here with Jeff Rueter from The Athletic to talk about MLS 101 and GAM and TAM and all that stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the playoffs over the weekend, shall we? So obviously we know Columbus right now doing some good things in Major League Soccer. They win to start their playoffs in the knockout round. They go to penalty kicks. They knock off DC United and advance again in the knockout round by penalty kicks. Now they host Red Bulls over the weekend, who just claimed the Supporter Shield in Major League Soccer, and they get a 1-0 win and are sitting pretty in the MLS playoffs, Brad.
Yeah. With the Crew matchup, it really shows you how big of an asset Zach Steffen is with his penalty kick saves. He kept the match. He kept the clean sheet at the end of the first match against the Red Bulls. It's just huge. So congrats to them. I think this is actually something FC Cincinnati needs to look at. You look at how clubs build their rosters, and typically the goalkeepers get paid the least amount of any position. So I'm trying to see who might we be able to bring in, see who can be worth the money and hopefully be a big building block as this team moves forward.
So the Crew get a result. Their 1-0 win over New York Red Bulls. They'll head to New York for the second leg of that semifinal matchup. So that should be a good one. Obviously, we watched the Cascadia Cup kickoff again over the weekend. Portland, Seattle, that's always a heated rivalry. That's going to be, Columbus, Cincinnati, we're hoping will turn into something like that. But the Portland gets a 2-1 win over Seattle. Seattle does get the away goal, which is important in that matchup. Although Seattle losing 2 key guys to injury, Roldan and Marshall, both going down in that match. So they're hoping that they can be healthy for that second leg matchup. We also saw over the weekend. Atlanta United go into Yankee Stadium and get a 1-0 win. It was a narrow win, but they get it done. They get the away goal as well, so they're up 1-0 in that semifinal matchup. And then in the final match of the night, it was Real Salt Lake and Sporting Kansas City. A Real Salt Lake team, by the way, who had no business being in the playoffs to begin with, because all LA had to do was beat Houston in the final week of the season. They were up 2-0 at halftime and blew that lead. Real Salt Lake gets a gift. They then go to LAFC and knock off Bob Bradley's squad. And now here they are. They're sitting tied 1-1 with Sporting Kansas City in that matchup. So if you haven't been tuned into the MLS playoffs, you absolutely should. This is some good soccer being played, and it's exciting. So that's the latest surrounding the MLS play. I got to stop saying the MLS playoffs. I got to stop saying the in front of MLS. So I'm sure Brad and Brian are going to correct me off the air. But no, this is a good time to get involved with playoff soccer. Major League Soccer doing some good things right now. All right, let's segue a little bit, shall we? We're pleased to be joined here on the phone by Jeff Rueter. He is the MLS writer over at The Athletic Minnesota, and he joins us now on the Kings Hammer Hotline to talk a little MLS 101. Jeff, welcome to Cincinnati Soccer Talk. How are you?
Doing well, and don't worry about throwing the in front of MLS. Whatever it takes to get people pissed off at you online, I think you take that avenue and just follow it.
Well, thank you again for being with us, Jeff. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that you kind of covered Minnesota's jump into Major League Soccer a few years ago, and you kind of saw a roster build there from a second-tier side in NASL to Major League Soccer. A little bit different for FC Cincinnati as they go from USL to Major League Soccer, but it's still D2 to D1. So we're excited to have you on the show with us tonight to give us a little background on this. Let's talk a little bit about the next couple of months and what all is going to be involved for FC Cincinnati heading into the 2019 inaugural season in Major League Soccer.
Well, to be honest with you, there's two ways that this could go. The first way is that you're going to gradually start hearing about players signing. Most often it'll start with player retention. So it looks like Manuel Ledesma is going to come back. You're going to be hearing about a couple more soon. I've got a report that I'll probably put out tomorrow about a Cincy player that's signing for next season. So you're going to start hearing more of that. You're going to be getting some sort of rumors about where the team is scouting. I saw that there are a few former players and club personnel who've been signed on as scouts who are going to be doing some international trips. They're going to get some silly season buzz with that, with like newspapers in Germany who are tweeting out pictures of your scouts just sitting in the bleachers watching a second or first division game. You'll get the waiver draft, the re-entry draft, the super draft, the draft of drafts. You actually don't get the draft of drafts this year because you don't have an expansion partner, do you? But it's just going to be every single week you're going to be getting a different mechanism that you're going to be building your roster. And obviously the ideal situation, you wish that you could say that you'll have everyone but the rookies, but the super draft picks ready to go before New Year's. That will not happen, and that's fine. You're going to be seeing a lot of people who are picked up, whether it's the expansion draft, which always, I think that's mid-December this year, if I remember right. But you're going to start to see these players come in more and more, but really it's going to be through the end of January. And honestly, through the beginning, the first month of the season, that the team's still going to be tweaking its inaugural roster.
I think everybody in Cincinnati is just looking forward to the process and seeing what players come in, what players going out. We've already heard about Fabian Johnson, and we see our coach doing the plane trips around Europe right now. So I think a lot of us are looking forward to that. But one of the things we wanted to bring you on is we wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the MLS roster building works. You talked about bringing retention of current players. You talked about bringing new players in, but really the MLS it's not really a salary cap. I like to call it a salary budget. There's a lot of different intricacies. You've got the overall budget for spots 1 through 20, but then you got GAM and TAM, and then you get into the supplemental and reserve rosters. First of all, can you kind of break down that spots 1 through 20 and that little over $4 million that FC Cincinnati gets to use so far towards that salary budget?
Yeah, so basically what's going to happen with that spots 1 through 20, those are going to be the main guys. Those are players who have aged out of being either the supplemental roster. There is a season-ending roster that you hope to never see a player land on, but it happens sometimes. The reserve roster, obviously, too. So with the senior roster, 20 players, like you said, count against we're going to use 2018 numbers, and that's just going to increase slightly. The CBA won't change between now and then, most likely, barring something dramatic. So it's just going to be an incremental change of some 100,000 or two. But for this year, players 1 through 20 took $4.035 million of the salary budget. Keep in mind, a designated player's salary budget hit is $504,375. So what you have to do is you have to split it up. Some teams might simplistically look at it and say, okay, that's going to be $200K per player. That would be the most baseline. And then obviously if you increase, that means you have to have X number of players lower. So you're doing the arithmetic with that. This does not count for players who, let's say someone gets injured in March for the rest of the season, you put them on the disabled list or the injured reserve. Those players do not count against the senior budget. It's the most cynical way that you can open up a senior roster slot to sign a new player, but it happens a lot. Let's say you have a young goalkeeper. Let's say Spencer Ritchie comes back, and you decide that Spencer Ritchie isn't ready to be sitting as a number 2 goalkeeper, and you want him to be playing every week. If you loan him out into the USL or for some reason abroad, he does not count as a senior player if he was above the threshold to be a senior player. So players who are loaned out, players who are hurt don't count against that, but otherwise these are going to be your core guys. For the supplemental roster, that's spots 21 through 24, they don't count against the senior budget, that $4 million figure. It can be filled with players who are either on the senior minimum, which last year was $67,500. It could be homegrown players, which I don't think you'll run into any of in the first year. Generation Adidas players, so someone you might draft at the first pick in the super draft if they came out early, or any. they do have a special place for designated players from the super draft, but I don't think you'll ever see that happen in our lifetimes. Or homegrown players who are earning more than the senior minimum. Those players will go in there. So most likely you're going to see other teams as homegrown players. This happened with Minnesota United when they acquired Colin Martin from DC United. He was a homegrown with DC. He was still on a homegrown's wage, which means he's on the supplemental roster for Minnesota United. Or Generation Adidas players. So Mason Toy and Abu Dunladi are still Generation Adidas players. They're still in that supplemental figure. Senior minimum. So a player like Brent Coleman, who came up on close to the minimum in his first year in 2017, he was a supplemental player at first.
And he joined you. Could earn. Like, he joined you from NASL, right?
He joined Minnesota United from NASL, right. So He had been there since 2013, and then he was a holdover, and now he's a regular starter, and with his new contract, I don't think he'll be on the supplemental roster anymore. He'll be a senior spot. The reserve roster, this is 25 through 28. So we're good so far?
Oh, yeah. Keep going, man. You're on a roll. Yeah.
Great. So I know that this is a lot of numbers. This is just a lot of throwing out wages. I'm going to try to give examples as much as I can. What I will say in advice from one journalist to another group who is trying to figure out this roster rules, you will never fully master all of the rules, and that's okay. They are as clearly as they can be spelled out on the league's website. I'll send one of you a link so you can bookmark this. I certainly do. But there's a fantastic saucy little line in the beginning of this that says MLS reserves the right to change and alter these rules as they go at any given time. So it's not going to be perfect. It's not etched in stone. You just work with what they tell you at the time. Okay. Reserve roster, 25 through 28. This could be players who earn the reserve minimum, which means they're younger than 24 years old when the league year starts. Or they're homegrown players that are still on that lower wage. So senior minimum, that 67,000 figure, cannot be a reserve roster player. The reserve minimum salary is 54,000. Generation Adidas players can't be there. But let's say you draft someone in the super draft who's on a lower contract. So maybe this is the first pick in the second round. You trade back in for the 20th pick with probably Columbus or whoever. Then that player could be a reserve. And then there's reserve spots 29 through 30 who have to be homegrown players. So teams like Dallas and Atlanta, not Atlanta this year, but Dallas, RSL, Red Bulls, I think they all utilize spots 29 and 30 because of the number of homegrowns that they have. So that's the roster. That's how that works out. You've got 20 players who are over the age of 24 who are making at least $67,000. You've got 4 more players who can be Generation Adidas or homegrowns from other rosters, young players, players who are on that 67,000 figure, or then 4 more players who are younger than 24 who aren't Generation Adidas players and who are on 54,000.
Now, there's a couple terms that you threw in there, and we'll probably touch on these a little bit later. But Generation Adidas players and homegrown players, I'm sure we're going to touch on a little bit later. But I want to get to, obviously we're familiar with designated player because we've got Fernando Adi. That's a DP that we've been talking about that pretty much all summer. So folks know what a DP is. But what about GAM and TAM? Can you help explain that a little bit to folks who aren't familiar with those two terms?
Yeah, looking at the mentions on your call for questions, it sounds like everyone's very happy with Fernando Adi and is very excited to see him lining up for you guys next year. So we'll just move on past him. So there are 2 different types of allocation money, GAM and TAM. TAM is the easiest one just to lock down. There's essentially one use for targeted allocation money, and that would be for targeted allocation money players. It's a bit more limited. So these are for players who are going to earn between either their salary or a possible transfer fee, anywhere between, I'm going to simplify these numbers for time, $500,000 and $1.5 million. So Zlatan Ibrahimovic came over on a free transfer, essentially. His salary is $1.5 million. The Galaxy had $1 million worth of targeted allocation money left, so they were able to buy him down. He only costs, against their salary budget, $504,000, just like a designated player would. But it allows you to basically, when you're looking at those spots 1 through 20, spots 1 through 3, they're going to cost just over $500,000 each, but you can go gangbusters on that. You can spend technically over $1.5 million on any of them. Some players you might have under that 1.5 for salary and transfer fee, but then you can buy them down later once you get a second player. So that'll all make sense once you have real-life examples coming in. Minnesota's running into that right now with Angelo Rodriguez. They have to wait until they sign a second DP before they buy him specifically down because they don't have enough to buy him down immediately. Minnesota fans don't understand that one, so I won't spend too much time on that. But targeted allocation money allows you to take that spots, let's say 4 through 10 on your roster, and increase the quality of those players that much more given the salary budget. So if you want to sign like an $800,000 a year winger, like I guess Johnny Russell a couple of years ago probably would have been that type. Diego Valeri entered MLS on $800,000 a year with Portland. If you wanted a player on that salary, they would be a targeted allocation money player. And so you're saying, okay, we'll give the league back $300,000 of our targeted allocation money. He's going to cost against our salary budget that $504,000, but his salary, we are still personally paying him $800,000 a year. So that's what targeted allocation money is for. That's the only use for it, really. Go ahead.
And this is all money that's supplied by the league to grow the fan base. The targeted allocation money isn't extra money that our ownership has to come up with. This is money given to all the clubs. They're given $1.2 million each a year, and they're saying, go with it, improve the quality of your squad, correct?
Right, and this was basically 8 years after the Beckham rule, the designated player rule. They're saying, okay, well, you've got these 3 players who are great, and then everyone else is upset because they can't earn more than whatever the league maximum was. And so this was a way to incentivize that, or to increase the value of the players beyond the big 3 designated players. Allocation money can be traded just like any player, any draft pick. So sometimes you'll see fun trades where you'll see like $150,000 of targeted allocation money going to one team for $100,000 of general allocation money from another, which just depends on what each team wants to use the funds for. General allocation money is very flexible. Talking to a couple of general managers across MLS before doing this interview, and before a piece that I wrote for The Athletic, they think that general allocation money right now is about 30% more valuable than targeted allocation money. So what GAM can do, you can still use it for the same thing as TAM if you have no other use for it, because once a certain amount of time passes for transfer windows, that money evaporates. So teams sometimes will just use the general allocation money like TAM to get better players for that spots 4 through 10. What it can also do is it can also affect players who would be above $1.5 million. So in theory, even though Darwin Quintero is still a DP for Minnesota United, or Fernando Adi, if they want to lower that $500,000 that Fernando Adi costs against the salary budget, you could use $100,000 of general allocation money so that even though Adi earns the exact same amount, his salary budget charge is $100,000 less, so he's on $400,000, which opens up what you can do with the rest of your roster by $100,000. So if you want to, you can use it so that you don't have players eating up an eighth of your salary budget, which is incredibly important. It can also affect players who are below that senior threshold. So if you have a player who's earning $300,000 and you want them to only cost like $200,000 against your budget, you can use $100,000 of general allocation money. What it does is it gives you a lot of flexibility so that you can raise the entirety of your roster that much more because you have more room to work with. Sometimes simplistically, GAM, general allocation money, is described as extra salary cap room just because you're able to use it in so many ways to lessen how much players cost against the salary budget. So that will always be the most valuable of the two different forms of allocation money.
Okay, Jeff. So we know that every roster needs to be around $4 million. We realize that the league gives you extra TAM and GAM to play with, and then the owners, even on top of that, have some discretionary money they can mess with. I wanted to ask you real quick for the viewers that maybe see a number like Toronto. Their roster, I think in 2018, was projected at $26.6 million. Whereas Minnesota's is around 8.5 million. So what is the gap? Why is that gap so big?
A big part of that allocation money actually does get kicked out sometimes, like incentive-wise. So general allocation money, the worst teams will actually accrue even more. Like I'm trying to remember how the exact breakdown is. Here it is. Okay, so $200,000 is the base for general allocation money handed out per year. If a team doesn't make the playoffs, that's another $200,000 for the next window. If a team does qualify for the CONCACAF Champions League, that's $140,000. If a player is transferred to a non-MLS club, that comes back to the club in general allocation money for a portion of it. So what people keep forgetting about Toronto, because they were so good for 2 years there. 2016-17, one of the best teams ever assembled in MLS, maybe the best in my opinion. They were so bad for the 4 years leading up to that run that they actually acquired some of this bonus money because they were missing the playoffs. And then they would also be making the CONCACAF Champions League by virtue of winning the Canadian Cup, or whatever they should call it now, the U.S. Open Cup equivalent in Canada, which essentially was coming down to 2 NASL teams, maybe a USL team, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto. In the last few years, it's just been 4 teams, Ottawa, and those 3. So they were winning that. They were getting an extra $150K a year, and so they were able to really boost the value. So they could trade that GAM for a higher value of TAM, which means that they could get more of those players who cost between $500,000 and $1.5 million. There's inflation involved too, and once a player is a DP, they can go much higher. I think all 3 of Javinko, Bradley, and Altidore are on at least $4.5, $5 million, maybe more if I remember right. I think they're 3 of the 10 most expensive players. So that's going to eat up a lot of that kind of value that a lot of targeted allocation money players, some who didn't land like Akeche, some who did land like Victor Vasquez. So there's a wide range there, but they were really savvy about how they accrued all of the allocation money, and ultimately when they did go above and beyond for those designated players, they went higher than just about any MLS team's been willing to go.
We're hanging out with Jeff Rueter, MLS writer over at The Athletic Minnesota. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Rueter, Rueter. And Jeff, obviously FC Cincinnati fans very familiar with the player acquisition process for the United Soccer League, which is going to be vastly different than Major League Soccer. Can you explain how it's going to be a little bit different for fans of Cincinnati to understand how players actually become FC Cincinnati players moving forward?
Sure. So the first thing will be, yes, those players that you already know from 2017, 2018. Some of those players will be coming back. That's pretty straightforward. When you're a team moving up from a lower division, the same thing happened with Minnesota, with Portland, Vancouver, Montreal, Orlando City all before you. You get first right of refusal on your own players. So even if LAFC was coming in and saying, hey, we think Jimmy McLaughlin looks promising, we want to sign him, Cincy would get the first right at Jimmy before they can make that move. So there's that. There's also usually a first right of refusal on other lower division players. So if Joe Greenspan from Pittsburgh, also named to the best 11 today, if he was making the move up, Cincy would have to pass on him, and then it would go in the order of the team that claimed him. So that's going to be another mechanism you look for. Minnesota ultimately didn't use that, which surprised a lot of people. They actually were talking with Nazmi Al-Badawi at that point, and then just never paid North Carolina what they wanted at the time. So that's another mechanism. The reentry draft and the waiver draft, that's various ways of players who have left their current MLS clubs. And so it's the first right to get those players back on an MLS roster, because all contracts are through MLS. So there's no true free agency unless a player is 28 years old and has been in the league for 8 years, which means that if a player is 26 years old, even if they've been in the league for 8 years, they're going to have to go through that reentry draft. So sometimes you'll get some gems in there. I think Minnesota didn't get anyone in that draft. I think, if I remember right, it might have been Jeff Lorenowitz. No, Jeff Lorenowitz was a free agent. Atlanta picked up someone through that. So you'll be able to get players through there. You'll have at least 4 super draft picks to work with, because there are 4 rounds. Obviously, trades could affect that, whether you gain more picks or you trade away your picks. For a couple of years, Philadelphia Union were trading theirs away and then pretty quickly corrected course and would usually end up with 2 or 3 first-round picks a year for a few years. So you'll see a lot of movement on Super Draft Day, which is January, I want to say the 11th in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So if any of you are there, say, hey, I'll be there. So that's another common way. And then global transfer market. So that's where you're going to be seeing international players, American players like Fabian Johnson coming home. That's where you're going to have to build out the rest of it. But for a large portion of it, you're going to be seeing trades. So looking back at Minnesota's offseason leading up to their first year, they're not the sexiest deals. You're seeing a 4th-round pick for Joe Greenspan. You're seeing a future 4th-round pick for Cullen Martin. You're seeing a 3rd-round pick for another super draft selection. So it's not always the most glamorous. Sometimes you will see outright $400,000 or more in allocation money for Kevin Molino, for example, or Ethan Finley, who was also traded for allocation money. That's another way that you'll see a lot of players move around from the league.
So I think a lot of questions on a lot of FC Cincinnati fans' minds right now is who's coming back. You've mentioned Fernando Adi. He'll be a lock for DP. Alashe, he's already on an MLS deal. Jeff Carlisle's mentioned. Ledesma, he's going to be signing. I think we've got a good idea on some I think we've got ideas on players who I would expect to probably be locks, like a Forrest Lass or a Corbin Bone, who've done really well the last couple of years. You said Nazmi Al-Badawi, but my question is, how many players do you think FC Cincinnati might be able to keep on the squad coming up, and where might they fit on an MLS roster? Because there's only so many real spots in the under 24 and the reserve rosters, the supplemental rosters. Do you think that might limit the number we might be able to take up with us?
No. It won't limit that much. I think one thing, even though Cincinnati is one of the higher spending teams in USL, it's still, in general, the lower half earners on any USL team are going to be well below the MLS minimum. So a player like, let's say Corbin Bone comes back, it really might not be more than that 67,000 hit. Again, Brent Coleman moved up at that. A couple of fullbacks who've been on Minnesota for 6 years ended up at 80 and 90,000 a year. So it doesn't really affect. you can follow up if you want to and ask on the merit of bringing players back, because I'm just going to try to get through how many are possible first. But I think that is a good discussion to have too. But I do think overall you're looking at it, you do need to build a roster of 28 players, where right now you have 2 signed to MLS contracts, Alashe and Adi, and you need to get 26 more players in before ideally training camp opens in the beginning of February. So if you think that you have players who are at worst squad players for your first year in MLS, you bring them up. You have to bring them up. And you look at positions, key areas like center back. It's going to be so hard to be able to pry 5 center backs away from other MLS teams or other international teams who you think are going to be of a high caliber. So you bring up 1 or 2, and that's okay. And that's really common. The midfield, central midfielders cost a fair amount on the transfer market. Striker with Fernando Adi, it's why you had to pay so much to get him. Those kind of things, those kind of players are going to cost money, and they're going to cost allocation money and other resources. So keeping that in mind, if you have a player, a central midfielder that you think is worth bringing on, good locker room guy maybe, good leader, tidy on the ball, is not going to make mistakes, even if you think he's too slow or even if you don't think he's going to get assists. If he's going to be stable and a good presence for the team, you bring them up too. So overall, I think if you saw, I'm trying to remember, Minnesota, I think, brought up 8 or 9. If you saw that figure for Cincinnati, that's not a cause for concern. I know I wrote something for The Athletic about the number that each of the last 6 teams that had moved up, how many they had brought with them. I'm pretty sure Vancouver brought up 13 players, if I remember right. Portland brought up 10, Orlando City 8, Seattle 5, Minnesota 7, Montreal 4. So there's really no rhyme or reason as far as how those teams did and how many players they gave key minutes who had been on their USL or NASL iteration. So I wouldn't say there's like a hard limit of if you have more than 4, your team is going to be historically bad, for example. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about, we have 3 months to build a roster now. Who's going to be able to come along for the ride and who's not up to the level. So I would say even if you see 8 or 9, that's not a bad thing.
And that was a good. I was going to ask you about the merit, because I know we had we were thinking that might be a topic tonight between you and I. You know, I thought that, you know, watching the playoffs, especially this weekend, seeing the caliber and speed of play, and I'm not sure FC Cincinnati was there. And when you don't have those homegrown player rights, you really only get to fill 28 positions and not 30 unless you're lucky and can pry a homegrown spot away. Mm-hmm. So kind of what I'm hearing from you is it'll be more cost effective for FC Cincinnati to bring some of these players up the first year. And then am I hearing you right? Maybe they might be able to use some of that GAM, maybe buy them down, fit more players, maybe higher quality players into those maybe spots 1 through 16, and that might have helped the roster as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just a massive overhaul of players that you're trying to bring in. You're going to be able to bring in some players from within the league. I can talk about a couple of guys who I think would be good to target from within the league later too. But you're needing to sign 26 guys now. So if you look at a usual transfer window, teams assessing, if a team does this very well, every window they'll look and they'll say 50% of the players that we signed, 60% of the players we signed are very good. They're definitely a part of our plans going into the next year. 75%, we're okay with. That other 15%, then the margin between good and okay, you're okay if they move on. You think you can do better, but you're going to miss on a quarter of your signings at least. That's just how this goes, and that's not always in a team's control, no matter how many scouts you have, no matter what analytical scouting data you're using. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it just runs into a player like Abu Danladi who gets hurt for most of the season. Sometimes it's a player who just you thought would fit really well because he's a Norwegian center back and he played in Minnesota, and lo and behold, he's not fast enough and you send Vadim Demidov out after 3 games. Those sort of things happen, but when you make 28 roster moves over the course of one window, 7 or 8 of them are going to flop. I guarantee it. And honestly, that's probably a lowball estimate too, just because of the sheer number of players you have to bring in. So you look at Atlanta's roster, they brought in a Tyrone Mears and let him go immediately. Harrison Heath immediately. Two of their goalkeepers immediately. They had another 5, I think, who were on the playoff roster and might have even made the bench, but they immediately let them go as soon as it was convenient to. So if you have a player that you know, I'm looking at your midfield right now, and you've got players like Michael Lahoud or Richie Ryan. And I know that a lot of fans look and say, like, okay, they're not going to be Ilie Sanchez over at SKC. They're not going to be Will Trapp. They're not going to be Artur. Of course not. But what they're going to be able to do is, let's say you're in the Open Cup, or let's say you have an injury to a key midfielder, you'll put them out there and you'll know, okay, they'll know exactly where to be. They don't have to acclimate to the city, which makes the transition to MLS that much easier for them. They're going to do a good job. Fans, frankly, are going to be more patient if they're not playing at 100% because they already have a history with them. And that's not to say that sentiment is needed as you build a roster, but it's a convenient thing to get people to look past weak areas of your roster. People will vouch for those players. Fans will vouch for those players far longer than someone who comes in from another team or another league and flops. So it does buy you some time to be able to bring in the player you think. Again, you need 6'8" midfielders. It might be worth it to bring up Lahoud and Ryan just because of the veteran presence, the positional savviness, and frankly, the number 6 in the modern game might be the hardest role to fill because teams are so reluctant to let a good defensive midfielder go.
So, speaking of players getting acclimated, and we've seen that. We saw that with 2 players we brought down early, and it's been a hot topic here in Cincinnati, as you've found out and on your Twitter questions here today. We brought down Fernando Adi, 3 goals. Mostly you've got kind of that last 20 minutes of a game role. So he didn't see a ton of playing time, lost 1 game, but that 1 game was in the playoffs, and fans are concerned. Should they be?
Do you want the good news first or the bad news first?
Let's go bad first.
Bad first, okay. The bad news, then, is that when Fernando Adi was brought in by Cincinnati, I was a little bit surprised. Not because he's not a good player. When Fernando Adi is on his game, when he's motivated, when he's hungry, he still can be one of the 5 or 6 best strikers in Major League Soccer. I have no doubts about that. The thing was, it would usually be every 9 months or so where word would start coming out of Portland that Fernando Adi was looking at his contract and thinking he deserved more. Maybe he'd be looking at a new DP from another team. Maybe he'd be looking at a new DP from the same team. Maybe he would just be looking at his expenses from the last month. But whatever the reason, every 6 to 12 months, you would hear rumors coming from that Fernando Adi wants a raise. Team may be exploring a transfer for him to Liga MX, to China, to Belgium. There are about 10 different leagues that I've heard over the last 6 years. So 5 years maybe. So with that in mind, Fernando Adi is the kind of player who is, as with every striker, lives and dies off of his confidence. If the goals aren't coming for him, if he looked at USL and thought this is going to be a walk in the park and he's having to work for it more, maybe he's losing confidence. So if you think that getting back to MLS, facing better competition every single week, and him now playing with a chip on the shoulder because the fan base doesn't love him like Portland's fans did, then that could help. The other good news with Fernando Adi, though, is that if you were looking at him coming to USL and FC Cincinnati's decision not to loan him back to an MLS team or to a foreign team of a similar caliber, it was never going to work. You don't have a player who's a Golden Boot contender, who's a Timbers MVP, who's an MLS Cup winner, scored some massive goals in his short MLS career already over 5 years, I guess. The Timbers' all-time leading goal scorer. And if he's playing against the second division now, I guarantee that he had no idea what the USL was. He never played for Timbers 2. He never even did an injury rehab stint there. So he probably wasn't watching it every week. He didn't know what he'd be up against. He didn't know what the road trip to Bethlehem Steel would look like compared to going to LAFC. So that's going to be such a culture shock. And when he hears that he's going to MLS, I'm just thinking for me personally, yeah, maybe you look at it and say, okay, I'm earning the same amount. I'm already guaranteed a spot next year. Take your time. And I don't blame him at all for that either. A guy like Fatai Lashe has more to prove because he's not a DP. But if you're Fernando Adi, that's 6 months to get used to the city and to eventually feel your way out with the new coach and hopefully be ready to go with a full preseason with a new team. So I don't think the 3-goal stat that you threw out or the losses, none of that is a cause for concern for me with Fernando Adi. Fernando Adi is a proven MLS goal scorer. He will be just fine, assuming that he is still then entrusted with leading the line. But if the team goes out and they draft first overall a striker, or if they go out and they bring a TAM striker, yeah, you might have a hard time getting a return on investment for what Fernando Adi is earning.
Well, I think one of the key things with Adi's contract is it was a 2-year deal. So, he's got some stuff to play for if he wants another big deal, because you think about it, he's, 27 now? I think he's turning 28 soon. He can be right around 30 when this deal comes to a close. So he might be thinking he might have one or two, probably one good contract ahead of him. So, I think that's something to watch out. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what does FC Cincinnati, need to do to unlock him? And, how could that revolve around their designated player strategy with, possibly one or two more additional signings in that area heading into the season?
Well, I think that what Cincinnati is going to need to do is go back and watch the 2015 playoffs or the 2016 Portland Timbers season, 2017 when they won the Western Conference in the regular season, and just watch how did Caleb Porter get the most out of Fernando Adi? Because that's going to be what he's most comfortable with, right? Maybe it helps when you have Diego Valeri playing beneath you, but maybe that just means you need to get the best possible number 10. Or you hope that there were conversations between the club front office, Alan Koch, and Fernando Adi saying, look, the next 4 months aren't going to be what we're bringing you for. We don't care if you score 20 goals or 2. We don't care if you set records, make SportsCenter top 10, any of that stuff. All we need you to do is get used to the city, get used to the coach, and be ready to go for opening day of training camp in 2019. You have to hope that that's the message, and that there was no sort of talk of we need you to hit these benchmarks in this league that we're leaving next year in 3 months. So that would be another way to just remind him, clean slate, different league you're used to now. Don't worry about that trip to Bethlehem or to any of these other places, Penn FC, whatever. You're fine. Just go play your game. That's going to be big. And then when he looks around and he sees in the locker room players he played with, played against, or watched on TV, rather than guys that he's watching cold and might not be impressed with their level, that's also going to help him tremendously.
We got some social media questions for you, Jeff. This one coming from Dr. Hodenbaugh. I hope I said your name there, Doc. How important is successful scouting versus having deep pockets to be competitive out of the gate? Atlanta and LAFC spent decently and made it. Orlando and New York City FC spent big with mixed results. What's the right balance to make playoffs in year 1 or 2?
It's actually balance and spending across your roster. So that's where scouting comes in handy, because the more of those guys you can find that are only going to cost $150,000 to $300,000, especially less than $200,000, actually, less than what you would say would be average for the senior roster budget. The more of those guys that hit, the easier it is to alleviate pressure on the higher paid guys. Which means that if you have a Vadim Demidov who doesn't land, you're suddenly fine because you have a cheaper alternative who's ready to go and buy them time to figure out the rest of the back line. Scouting is huge. Scouting is huge to be able to do. You need to be able to hit that part of your roster. Every role in theory, but you can probably mask 5 true weak spots, 5 true weak players on your roster, for example. So what happened with Orlando and NYCFC is they didn't really focus too much on spots. If you're NYCFC, 4 through 20. If you're Orlando City, 2 through 20. Orlando City was very much built with a statement when they brought in Kaká, who I would imagine up until this winter was the last player to win a Ballon d'Or besides Messi and Ronaldo. It's been that long. And they looked and they said, okay, this is our guy. We're good to go. The next 2 DPs, Brian Rochez and Carlos Rivas, young players who are moving up from a much worse league, neither of them hit. They drafted a generational talent in Kyle Laren. But if you look at that initial roster, Adrian Heath actually did a really good job of getting the most out of a poor defense. Their marquee returning U.S. men's national team addition was Breck Shea. Converted him to a left back momentarily, which was incredibly bizarre. But working with a player like that, working with a midfield that just wasn't clicking, and trusting Christian Ngita, who was a non-allocation money player, if I remember right, and played out of his mind for a long time in the midfield until he got hurt. That's where Orlando went right. For New York City, they brought in David Villa, one of the best VP signings of all time, Frank Lampard, who didn't contribute at all in 2015, really, and Andrea Pirlo, who didn't join until mid-season, and at that point was clearly not athletic enough for MLS. But they didn't have the depth. So what they did is they reinvested in that middle level. They brought in different designated players. 2016 they had the same DPs, but they also brought in one of the best coaches overall the league has seen, Patrick Vieira. So the balance, teams are no longer able to thrive by just focusing on their DPs, nailing all three and mailing it in. The league is too much better now, and the sport, obviously, because the quality of the league is better, it means all 11 players are important on the field. So spending at the top isn't just going to be enough. It's a matter of getting it right through your first, I would say, 18 guys, and then you'd be good to go.
One of the things that a lot of people talk about, and we've talked about on this pod today, has been the roster build and bringing in high-profile signings on the field. But one of the areas we haven't necessarily talked about is off the field. We talked a little bit about scouting and player development, but we've seen a couple teams recently bring in Bob Bradley, going to LA. We've seen Tata Martino come into LA, and they've been immensely successful. You've seen Adrian Heath in Minnesota, and I believe he was actually the head coach in Orlando too that first season, not be as successful. Now we're bringing Alan Koch up. He's had some success this year. He had success in the Open Cup run, but I know you had some comments on Twitter this week, comparing him versus maybe a Gio Savarese, and I know they've been talking about a lot of talk about Mark Dos Santos getting a job, I think, on the West Coast. I can't think of where they're talking about going, but kind of want to get your thoughts.
Vancouver, yeah.
Kind of wanted to get your thoughts. I think your coach was, I'll let you handle it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. So the 2016 NASL season, Minnesota United was not coached by Adrian Heath. They were coached by Carl Craig. Carl was immensely beloved by everyone in and around Minnesota soccer, not just Minnesota United, but he was working with high schools. He was working with youth camps for the last decade or so. He was a Newcastle born. He was a true Geordie. He was 50 years old. Fantastic guy. The 2016 Loons underperformed, frankly. They had a very talented lower division roster, built in a lot of ways very similarly to how Cincinnati built their roster this year. But between an injury to their starting number 6 in the first week of the season, Greg Jordan, who now plays, if I remember right, he's with Penn FC now, right? So he got hurt for the year, ACL tear. A couple of international players couldn't really latch on the way that the team hoped. Didn't work out. Carl didn't get the job. Adrian Heath got the job, right? So what surprised me, though, was that the team didn't make that MLS coaching decision until early December, which makes perfect sense. That didn't surprise me. You want to wait to see how the full season goes, how the team rallies behind Carl if you think he's your guy, or ultimately who's available, who gets fired from MLS that you think is worth it, who's the best assistant, who showed a lot of promise in the playoffs. Cincinnati didn't wait. Middle of the season, it was suddenly confirmed that they'd signed what was it, a new 2 or 3 year deal? You guys will know better than that. For Alan Koch. Okay, 2. So already locked him in. The theory, I guess, is that you want a coach who's comfortable. You want a coach who's not worrying, will I still have a job this winter? You want a coach who's able to focus on the rest of the season comfortably, not trying to overperform, and then be willing to and ready to go guns a-blazing heading into 2019. That makes sense in theory. I guess my question is the wisdom of entrusting that with Alan Koch in particular. If I'm being honest, the better version of FC Cincinnati was the John Hart's version. if I'm thinking back to which team played the best brand of football that would translate to Major League Soccer, that's last season. That's not this season to me, or it's the first season, you know? So that's one thing worth keeping in mind. That first season in particular, it looked like things were building in the right direction for that. If I'm looking, I didn't watch every single game of Cincy's like you did, but I watched, I would say, over 75% of them. And if I'm looking at how they're winning these games, a lot of times it's a 25-yard wonder goal from Manu Ledesma, or it's Naz Al-Badawi hitting a beautiful strike, or it's an impeccable cross from out wide. That's an easy tap-in. But then you're seeing simple mistakes in defense, and suddenly you're allowing 3 goals at home, or a crucial second goal when you're on the road against an inferior opponent. You're seeing Nashville absolutely dominate a game, and probably should have won in the first round if you're asking me. They went dominant, but they came in with the right game plan, with a coach who'd won MLS Cup and was able to just get his team to buckle in and frustrate FC Cincinnati. Cincinnati in 2018 was built as an all-star team of the lower division, and that works really well when you're playing against the lower division competition. But as you saw, Minnesota United was able to, again, frustrate FC Cincinnati in the Open Cup against essentially a first team, if I remember right, with some minor rotation in defense, if I recall. Able to frustrate, point out that Cincinnati didn't have clear game plans ready to go, and win on penalties. And that happened to Cincinnati both times in the postseason this year. I shouldn't speak to mood around him as a coach necessarily, but what I will say is, if you're not going to be able to drop a game plan that is, or a system, or have a base system, I guess, that is, you're going to be able to fall back on and say, okay, we tried this game plan for the matchup, didn't quite work. Let's go back to what we know. Like, think of Greg Berhalter in Columbus. Think of Jesse Marsh with the Red Bulls, Chris Harmless now with the Red Bulls. You know exactly what they're going to fall back on if the integral changes aren't working. I don't see Alan Koch having a single system like that. I look at this last season, and I see a lot of reliance on stars. And when you're thinking about that, it's, will a star coming in, will a Fabian Johnson, for example, and I'm not saying this is a guarantee, so don't report that, but let's say Fabian Johnson comes in, is he going to look and say, okay, this is a coach I buy into? I don't know, because there hasn't been a star like that before, and I think Fernando Adi in USL wasn't a good enough case study to prove if he can manage those kind of egos. But Gio Savarese worked with Raul and got Raul to buckle in for the 2 twilight years of his career and win the NASL championship. And that was when everyone looked at Gio and said, okay, this guy can do it. So I have a lot of questions about that. I think going in and blindly committing without seeing would be available, whether that's a Dos Santos, whether that's Robin Fraser out of Toronto, Kerry Zavagnin, out of Sporting Kansas City. Some of these guys are looking abroad. I question the wisdom of that. And so I think because of that, I worry about how Cincinnati could do in year one. But I've been proven wrong before.
Well, I mean, you've given us, I think, a lot to think about with that topic in particular. Cincinnati fans are used to winning. I know we don't have a ton of postseason success, but you got to remember there's only 4 losses all season, and so these fans would be heavily disappointed, and I think you'd see a lot of outcries should they start Major League Soccer season with a lot of losses racking up. So, I mean, that's something that if those concerns are valid, we'll see the fruit relatively quickly, because you'll hear a lot of screaming and kicking from Cincinnati online.
And keep in mind a lot of this too. Yeah, just 20 seconds. I mean, keep in mind too, all of this is just talking about how the coach did with the players he had over the last couple of years. I have no idea who's going to fill out the entire roster next year. So a lot of that could change too. Maybe it will be built like a super team, but just getting the most out of a collective of players who might be a cup below, which tends to be how expansion teams look beyond the top 6 players. That's where the question comes in.
Sure. But changing topics just a little bit, you were really instrumental last year. I felt like one of your strong suits was evaluating talent coming up from the lower leagues. You had your eye on Ledesma. You had your eye on Nazmi. You thought some of those guys deserved a shot at Major League Soccer. and we were lucky enough to snag. I know we snagged Nazmi away from the Chicago Fire, and we got Ledesma really before it got picked up. Who are 5 guys you think would just be amazing to see in an FC Cincinnati jersey?
Are these from the current roster, or are we looking at just from across MLS and USL?
Just really lower league talent. I feel like that's able to be snagged up. Or you can go further international. I mean, this is really a Twitter question from Bradley Meyer, so I'm just trying to figure out how he would want me to ask it.
Yeah, sure. I'll probably end up giving more than 5 names then. I think I said this during the season, but if you're able to get Spencer Ritchie on a permanent deal, I think that would be a good starting point to have as your kind of second or third goalkeeper. Young player who's able to learn the ropes, see what MLS is like, and then go from there. If you're looking for a starter, I would guess someone like Evan Bush in Montreal would be a really good look. He was statistically one of the best goalkeepers in MLS across 15 different goalkeeping categories. He was one of 2 or 3 who showed up on every single chart. Might be time for a change of scenery for him. And if I remember right, Evan Bush might be from Ohio. Concord Township, I think, rings a bell for some reason. I was just writing about him earlier today. Might be a goalkeeper to look at from within MLS. Like you had said, you're looking at the defense and you're saying you probably see like a Forrest Lasso is good to go for the next level, especially if you're looking at someone who would be maybe close to that league minimum. El-Badawi, you already mentioned. I mentioned Lahoud and Ryan, at least one of those two, to be able to kind of fortify the midfield positions because the midfield is so difficult to fill. Don't just look at Minnesota, look at LAFC. When Mark Anthony Kaye went down with an injury, they had absolutely nobody else, and they were absolutely picked apart by Real Salt Lake in that zone 14, that area that a number 6 would usually patrol on the field. Manu Ledesma will be back. Fatai Lasha will be back. You would expect like Corbin Bone maybe would be. Jimmy McLaughlin might be a good shout. Just as, they fill out the rest of the roster type guys. I think I just named your entire midfield there, actually, so fair play there. But if you're looking across the lower divisions, I think a guy like Joe Greenspan, who I know was brought on by Minnesota United, he looked fantastic. To me, I mean, he looked like the best defender of the season to me in the USL. You noticed, despite how good that Pittsburgh defense, that Riverhounds defense was, when he was missing for that stretch in the late spring, I think it was, the defense looked notably worse. And when he played, they looked a lot better. He offered a fair amount off of set pieces from headers. He's like 6'5", and having stood next to him in person, it feels much taller. Really good character dude, hard worker, still very young, especially for a center back. He's a guy that I would look at poaching from across the lower divisions as well. I liked a lot of what Bolu Akanyode did in Nashville. I think he scored a pretty big goal against Cincy, if I remember right. Or certainly to close Nashville's regular season, he scored the goal that clinched their postseason appearance. He's a true number 6. That was the only goal he scored all year, if I remember right. Also a young player, which is something that I look for kind of as I'm reading these tea leaves with players. Showed a lot of growth, his off-ball work, his just defending, cutting down passing lanes, the simple interceptions that don't make it to the highlight reel. He's been very good with that, confident on the ball, played with Red Bulls 2 for a little bit as well. He was a player that I looked at and said, okay, like that job well done in that case. I look at a player like Dylan Mares, who played for Indy this year, I believe. He was somebody when Indy was in the NFL that a lot of people expected Minnesota to go after. Very good playmaker for the level, which frankly, that kind of vision does carry. If you're able to pick out a pass, as long as you have the speed to execute the pass, that doesn't change much else. So I think that he might be a player that would be worth looking for. Beyond that, I think that, I think first you maybe don't rely on USL players, obviously, right? You're not saying, okay, we're going to sign 28 guys from the lower divisions. But so you look at what do you need to fill? Maybe you need another striker, and so you bring in Cameron Lancaster, right? And maybe you say Louisville won't be going to MLS. You could probably convince him to come on pretty cheap. He's just a pure goal scorer, a little bit like a Christian Ramirez was or a Dom Dwyer, where you can't early in the career find why they score goals, but they always do. And the more that you watch, you say, okay, it's finding space, or it's finding the right passing lane, all of these things, that might be a good player to look at as well. So I think that's a pretty good foundation. If you need another goalkeeper, Ottawa's next in career. I think he made the best 11 today. He's been a really solid goalkeeper in the past before. So players like that, I think that you're actually able. There's nothing wrong with an MLS team looking at the lower divisions and saying 4 of these guys can make our 18 every week. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And frankly, the smartest teams often do. Again, look at Mark Anthony Kaye with LAFC. People kind of looked and wondered why he was starting week 1 as a number 6 for Bob Bradley's vaunted side alongside Carlos Vela and Diego Rossi. And he was possibly the most important player to what he was doing, to the point that when he was injured after they couldn't find a replacement for him, the whole season was kind of doomed from there.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting. There's no question about that as far as filling the roster. It pains me to say it, but yes, I think Lancaster would look good in orange and blue, provided that that's what will be the colors for FC Cincinnati moving to MLS. I'm assuming that that's what it'll be. But I got to ask, so next year, obviously, we kind of touched on it a minute ago about, FC Cincinnati fans are used to winning. They're used to success. And obviously, it's rare that expansion teams in Major League Soccer do well. I mean, LAFC this year is kind of an outlier. Atlanta United too, another one. Maybe it just seems like when you hear expansion, the first thing you think of is, oh, it's going to be a long year. So what does success look like for FC Cincinnati in year 1 in 2019?
So I know that when you're naming recent ones, LA and Atlanta coming in consecutive years, makes it look like the standard or expectation maybe for a USL side is that much higher now. It just isn't. If you're looking, LAFC was always going to be deep pocketed with the sheer number of billionaire owners that they had and the star power, and obviously being the in-city Los Angeles team. That was always going to be a success. And they had the brain trust in John Thornton, who's smart enough to be able to execute those moves and make that work. Yeah. You look at Atlanta, you've got NFL money with Arthur Blank. You have a stadium that's privately financed and almost done at that point, which means that the entirety of the owner's money towards MLS could go towards players and off-field necessity with the front office. You brought in Darren Eales, who brings a Premier League mind for player acquisition, who's been studying on the rules. You got Carlos Bocanegra, who's been studying MLS rules and obviously played in the league for a little bit too. So you've got so much ability in that front office and so much money in both of those. So those were always going to be successful. You look at, people forget that like the Portland Timbers weren't good year 1. Vancouver Whitecaps were awful year 1. Montreal was okay in year 1. Orlando, New York City, Minnesota, Toronto for the first 9 years of their existence. These teams weren't playoff teams in year 1. Playoffs shouldn't be the expectation. That would be the goal. But the expectation, if you're looking at what makes a successful first year for FC Cincinnati, if you can look at over half of your first roster and say, these guys are going to be key players for us in 2020 in year 2, that's successful. Because what you're seeing right now with Minnesota United is that this is the 3rd straight winter where you know that they need to bring in 4 or 5 different starters. Last year, they didn't bring in a single starter, and it showed. And that's why the team allowed 1 more goal than their record-setting campaign the year prior, and why the attack really didn't seem to take off until Darwin Quintero was there, and then ultimately was screwed again once they traded Christian Ramirez. So what you need to be able to do is have enough of those players that you can build around, that you can count on, and can see as key contributors for a second year. That's success. Because then with that comes fans coming back to Nippert who hadn't been there before, fans buying merchandise, fans talking about it alongside the Bengals and the Reds, that kind of thing. And a lot of that does come from players that they can latch onto, whether it's from quality or it's lovability off the field as well. So that kind of thing would be success. A signing like Jerome Tieson in Minnesota wasn't announced with bravado. It wasn't Vadim Demidov, Francisco Calvo. Even you could say Miguel Ibarra coming back from Club Leon. but he was one of the team's best starters in year one, a two-sided fullback who's 31, has his green card. If you can get a player like Jerome Tieson, or I guess get Jerome Tieson, that kind of thing masks a lot of other issues that might take more strenuous work to fill the positions. But getting a fullback like that on $200,000, who's absolutely beloved by every single fan, that stuff goes a long way. So I would say it's going to take 18 months to figure out if it was a successful first year, really. The record, you'll make the playoffs, or most likely you won't, but it's building a core that can turn into a playoff contender by year 2 or year 3. That's a successful season.
Speaking of successful, I mean, dude, you have been on the show for an hour, on the line for a whole hour. You are officially a record breaker in the Cincinnati Soccer Talk record books for the longest guest we've had on. And by the way, we haven't dropped a single viewer, Jeff. I mean, you have been bringing it tonight with information. We cannot thank you enough for being on the show with us. For folks who want to check out your work,
viewers, right? Is that it? Yeah.
for folks who want to check out your work, where can they find you at? And fill us in on a little story you might be breaking tomorrow.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter at Jeff Rueter, Rueter. It's all over the gamut right now. I cover sport in Kansas City from far right now with the postseason. Minnesota United is going to be the main beat. Cincy, for some reason, I report on a fair amount too. You're probably going to be seeing something by the end of the week about one of the players that we talked about a couple of times in this segment being signed now officially. So that might be coming out tomorrow. That's a current roster guy. And yeah, overall, I mean, just watch the playoffs. And if I can plug one thing in particular,
go for it.
If you're watching this live or if you're listening to this Tuesday morning, vote. I'm not going to tell you who you should vote for, but it's 2018, guys. Like, there's so little excuse not to do it. Just do the thing. Just do it, and then I won't complain about it. So there you go. That's my plug.
Good stuff, Jeff. We really do appreciate you being with us. Fantastic stuff. And again, check out his work over at The Athletic, and go follow him on Twitter at Jeff Rueter. Jeff, thank you so much, and we'll look forward to doing it again soon.
Yeah, sounds good. And if record setters get any free swag or whatever, let me know. I can send you my address.
All right, we'll see if we can make that happen. Jeff, thanks for being with us.
Keep up the good work, guys.
That's Jeff Rueter joining us on the King's Hammer Hotline. Fantastic information. Again, check out his work. He does tremendous work there at The Athletic. So, long show. It's the first week of the month, and we're already an hour 15 into this bad boy. I need to give a shout out and thanks to our tremendous supporters. So let me do that here real quick before we begin to wrap things up. Thank you to King's Hammer and Tim Bronsel, Matt Adamczyk, Mama Subes, Brian Malone, Jamie Smed, Mike Hudson, Jonas Tom, Jack Emery, Mike Bowman, Kathleen Francis, Jesse King, Teresa Everidge, Matt Imholt, Segan Sagai, and Matt Long, John Davidson, Patrick Alani, Dave Tingler, Alex Yursky, Reese Johnson, Chris DeMeo, Claire Hughes, Carl Fight, Scott Griffith, Josh Leese, Kevin Johnston, Derek Smed, Greg Harrell, Jack Doyle, Doug Ross, James Denbo, Tom Grabo, the Cincy Superfan. I'm still waiting for Stevie to become a supporter there, Tom. You got to get on that. Tim and Tina Harris, Chris Howard, Sarah Spriggs, Paul Hetker, Michael Winland, Mattis Brumbach, Courtney Rice, Scott Party, Joe Collier, Richard Rolson. And finally, on the last slide here, we got Christina Sharma, Nate Hale, Brandon Jones, Adam Alexander, Chima John, Mike Berryman, Andy Rosen, Dan Village, Jeff Egan, Joseph Wells, Becky and Matt Ryan, Stephen Buckridge, Gary Randolph, AJ Stork, Alec Mackey, Jamie Lay, Angela Cardwell, Anthony Zawoski, Scott Kaplan, Colin Rink, Jason DeBrewer, Robert Finley, Arthur Oliva, Scott Wilson, and last but certainly not least, Stephen Alderman. Thank you so much for your support of Cincinnati Soccer Talk. We really do appreciate it. To learn more about how you can support the show, we do this on the first week of every month. We announce every single supporter name. Head on over to CincinnatiSoccerTalk.com/support. We're going to be doing a lot more engagement here with our supporters starting here this offseason. I've got some cool projects in store for that. So again, CincinnatiSoccerTalk.com/support is where you can do just that. Whew, okay, let's catch our breath. Let's wrap things up. It's a late night. We'll start with you, Bradley Weigel. Brad, thank you so much for being with us. And by the way, thank you for setting up that interview with Jeff. That was really cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think, hopefully our viewers did. Like you were saying, we didn't drop any viewers during his time, and I think it was great to hear his take and his honesty. Um, and we're gonna be used to that in Major League Soccer. You have educated outside influences like a Jeff Rueter, like a Bobby Warshaw, Paul Tenorio. You've got all guys around this league that are going to comment. Um, on the club, what they like, what they don't like. And so, I like his honesty and frankness. I think there's a lot to be positive of the team that they're going to build. I think we've got a nice solid base. I was a little worried at first on how many guys we might, be bringing up, but I think he makes some good points on why that is a strength and not a weakness. And also, I think maybe calm some of our fears on the Fernando Adi front. So it was great to talk to him. Can't wait to see a story tomorrow about a possible signing. And I honestly can't wait to talk to him again in the future. And then, like some more of the talking heads around Major League Soccer.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff, Brad. As always, appreciate you being with us. I'm sure you got to be up early for work there. So thank you again for setting up camp there in the Motel 6 you're there at in Goshen, Indiana. They left the light on for you.
Not quite roughing it that bad, but
Hey,
got to be economical.
I love me some combo day.
Ticket prices are going up, man. I can't be staying at the Ritz.
Good stuff. Final thoughts, Boston, Brazil, Mr. Razzle Dazzle Brazzle himself. He thought I'd get away with it this week, but I remembered.
It was close. It was a close call. No, so I was, I'm really glad to start this process. I was super bummed after losing our fourth match of the season, which of course happened to be in the playoffs. So, one shot and you're out. So I took a break, kind of stepped away from Reddit, from Twitter for a couple days, just super bummed. I discovered this weird thing outside of my house called a yard. Freaked me out. So I'm back inside and happy to get going with all of this Major League Soccer prep. And man, I'm looking forward to some of our upcoming guests. It's going to be a great offseason.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff, Boston, as always. I really do appreciate you being with us.
Glad to be on.
My final thoughts tonight, I have to give a shout out. Brian Weigel gave this information to us right before we went on the air tonight. Shout out to Thomas More Men's Soccer for winning the American Collegiate Athletic Association tournament. So congrats to them on winning that conference tournament. We're all about Cincy soccer, folks, whether it's the collegiate, professional with FC Cincinnati and the Dutch Lions. Maybe someday we'll start to delve into some high school soccer. That's all part of the growth process. Just like FC Cincinnati is growing, CST is growing, baby. So, again, thank you, Boston. Thank you, Brad, for being with us tonight. Thanks to Jeff Rueter from The Athletic. Again, I'm going to link his stuff in The Athletic on our show notes over at CincinnatiSoccerTalk.com. There you can find out how you can support the show as well. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of CST for Boston, Brazzle, and Brad Weigel. I'm Subes, reminding you to watch your tackles. I got to let everybody know. We're not going to be doing a show next week. Yes, we're not going to be doing a show next week because of the brand reveal for FC Cincinnati next Monday night. So we're taking the week off. So in the meantime, for those guys, I'm just running you watch your tackles, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Enjoy your week, everybody. All right.